I told NASA I would not sign that recommendation. I feel we're taking risks that we should not take. It'll have to come from the plant, if it comes from anybody, but not me.
On the morning of January 28, 1986, millions of Americans gathered around televisions in classrooms, offices, and living rooms, excited to witness what had become a somewhat routine event, the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger. The shuttle program, launched by NASA in the early 1980s, had already captured the public imagination with its reusable spacecraft and its promise of making space travel more accessible and frequent. But this launch carried an additional layer of anticipation. Among the crew was Christa McAuliffe, a school teacher from New Hampshire chosen to be the first civilian in space through NASA's Teacher in Space program. Children across the United States were encouraged to tune in, ready to watch one of their own kind, a teacher, break the boundaries of Earth and journey into space. What unfolded instead became one of the most shocking moments in modern history. Just 73 seconds after liftoff, the shuttle broke apart in a fiery explosion, killing all 7 crew members on board. The Challenger disaster became not only a national tragedy, but also a turning point in the history of NASA and space exploration. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The disaster did not emerge from nowhere. Rather, it was the culmination of a series of technical flaws, organizational oversights, and human decisions that combined in the worst possible way. At the heart of the catastrophe was a seemingly small component, the O-ring seals in the shuttle's solid rocket boosters. These rubber rings were designed to prevent hot gases from escaping during ignition and flight. But on that unusually cold Florida morning, the temperature had dropped far below what engineers had considered safe for the O-ring's performance. The freezing weather made the rubber brittle and less flexible, impairing its ability to properly seal. This vulnerability had been known within NASA and its contractor, Morton Thiokol, for years before the disaster. Engineers had observed erosion and damage to O-rings in previous shuttle flights, but the concerns had never translated into halting a launch. The danger was acknowledged, but it was gradually normalized, absorbed into the system as a known issue that was tolerated because flights had not yet failed because of it. The lead-up to the launch day was filled with tension and debate among engineers and managers. On January 27th, the night before the scheduled launch, Morton Thiokol engineers expressed alarm about the low temperatures forecast for the following morning. Some strongly advised delaying the launch, warning that the O-rings might not seal properly in the cold. But the culture within NASA and its contractors at the time was under immense pressure. The shuttle program had been sold to Congress and the public as a reliable, almost airline-like operation, with frequent launches and a high level of safety. Delays were costly not only financially but also politically, and NASA was already facing scrutiny over its schedule. Under pressure from NASA officials to provide justifications for going forward, Morton Thiokol managers reversed their engineers' initial recommendation, allowing the launch to proceed. The decision illustrated a culture where schedule and public image often outweighed technical caution, a theme that would later dominate the investigation. When the shuttle lifted off at 11:38 a.m., the excitement was palpable. The sky was clear, the shuttle gleamed in the sunlight, and the crowd cheered as the spacecraft roared upward. But within seconds, a plume of smoke appeared at the base of the right solid rocket booster. The compromised O-ring allowed hot gases to escape, creating a jet of flame that struck the external fuel tank. As the shuttle ascended, the flames burned through structural components, weakening the external tank until it gave way. The massive hydrogen and oxygen tanks inside the shuttle's fuel system ruptured, triggering the explosion that tore the Challenger apart before the horrified eyes of spectators. The shuttle disintegrated into pieces, plummeting into the Atlantic Ocean, where search and recovery crews would later work for months to retrieve debris and the remains of the crew. The aftermath was one of grief and disbelief. Schools that had tuned in to watch Christa McAuliffe's historic journey instead found themselves witnessing tragedy. The shock was magnified by the live broadcast, which meant the event was not only tragic but also communal, a moment of shared horror for the nation. President Ronald Reagan, originally scheduled to deliver the State of the Union address that night, instead addressed the nation with words of mourning and reassurance, calling the astronauts heroes and pledging that America's exploration of space would continue. His speech, somber yet inspiring, aimed to help a grieving country process the loss while also preserving the vision of space exploration. In the weeks that followed, the Challenger disaster prompted the creation of the Rogers Commission, a presidentially appointed panel tasked with investigating the cause of the tragedy. Chaired by former Secretary of State William P. Rogers, the commission included a diverse group of scientists, engineers, and astronauts, among them the famed physicist Richard Feynman. What the commission uncovered was not merely a single technical flaw, but a deeper story of organizational dysfunction. Feynman, in particular, became known for his plain-spoken, uncompromising approach. During televised hearings, he dramatically demonstrated the fragility of the O-rings in cold temperatures by immersing a sample in a glass of ice water, showing the world that the rubber lost elasticity when chilled. His experiment crystallized the essence of the disaster for the public. A small but vital component had failed because warnings were ignored. The Rogers Commission's report revealed damning evidence of a culture within NASA and its contractors that tolerated risks, normalized failures, and succumbed to bureaucratic and political pressures. Managers had accepted repeated erosion of O-rings in previous launches as acceptable rather than treating them as warnings. Communication between engineers and upper management was flawed, with concerns often minimized or dismissed. The decision to launch on January 28th was shaped not only by technical assessments but also by a determination to maintain the shuttle's schedule, particularly given the high-profile presence of McAuliffe. In essence, the Challenger disaster was as much a failure of organizational culture as it was of engineering. The consequences of the disaster reverberated throughout NASA and the space program. Shuttle flights were suspended for nearly 3 years, while NASA overhauled its safety procedures and redesigned the solid rocket boosters. The agency also re-examined its decision-making processes, seeking to empower engineers to voice concerns without fear of being ignored or overruled by management pressures. The Teacher in Space program was shelved, replaced with a more cautious approach to involving civilians in spaceflight. For many Americans, the image of the shuttle disintegrating against the blue Florida sky became a symbol of the dangers of complacency and the high stakes of technological ambition. The Challenger tragedy also had broader implications for how organizations understand and manage risk. The concept of normalization of deviance, later coined by sociologist Diane Vaughan, came to be closely associated with the disaster. This term described how repeated exposure to small failures without catastrophic consequences leads organizations to accept those failures as normal. NASA had seen O-ring erosion before and had flown missions successfully despite it. Each time, the absence of disaster reinforced the illusion of safety, making it easier to justify taking the same risk again. Challenger shattered that illusion, exposing the peril of allowing minor problems to be rationalized rather than corrected. For the families of the 7 crew members, Francis R. Scobie, Michael J. Smith, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Judith Resnick, Gregory Jarvis, and Christa McAuliffe, the loss was devastating and personal. They became symbols of sacrifice, remembered for their courage and dedication to exploration. Their lives and dreams were celebrated in memorials across the country, including the Challenger Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery and the Challenger Center for Space Science Education, founded by the families to honor the astronauts by inspiring future generations to pursue science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. In this way, their legacy continued, not just as a story of tragedy, but also as a source of hope and inspiration. The Challenger disaster also altered the trajectory of the shuttle program itself. Originally envisioned as a workhorse of space exploration, capable of launching satellites, conducting scientific experiments, and even serving as a potential platform for military missions, the shuttle was forced into a narrower role after the disaster. Ambitious plans were scaled back, and NASA focused more on safety and reliability than frequency of flights. The dream of routine airline-like space travel was set aside, replaced by a sobering recognition of the inherent dangers of venturing beyond Earth. It was not until 1988 that the shuttle program resumed, with the launch of Discovery, but the aura of invincibility had been permanently lost. As years passed, the Challenger disaster remained etched in the collective memory as a stark reminder of both human vulnerability and resilience. Teachers who had watched Christa McAuliffe prepare for space carried her story into classrooms, using it as a lesson in courage and the pursuit of knowledge. Engineers and policymakers studied the tragedy to extract lessons about risk, responsibility, and the importance of listening to dissenting voices. The disaster also foreshadowed future challenges for NASA, including the loss of the Space Shuttle Challenger in 2003, which bore eerie similarities in its origins, known risks that were underestimated until disaster struck. Both tragedies underscored the lesson that in complex systems, the greatest dangers often lie not in the unknown, but in the ignored. The story of Challenger is not simply about failure. It is about the intersection of human ambition, technological innovation, and organizational fallibility. It is about how even the smallest details, a rubber O-ring, can determine the fate of monumental endeavors. It is about how institutions, under pressure to perform and to inspire, can drift into dangerous patterns of decision-making. And it is about how a nation confronted with tragedy can mourn, yet still look upward, determined to continue exploring. The Challenger disaster remains one of the most painful chapters in the history of spaceflight, but also one of the most instructive, shaping how we understand safety, risk, and the pursuit of discovery. The haunting images of the shuttle's fireball and the twin trails of smoke arching back toward Earth endure in American memory. They serve as a visual reminder of a moment when excitement turned instantly to sorrow, when a nation was forced to confront the fragility of its technological dreams. Yet alongside those images stands another enduring vision, that of the 7 astronauts smiling in their pre-flight portraits, ready to risk everything for the sake of exploration and education. Their courage continues to remind us that progress is never without risk, but that risk must always be met with respect, vigilance, and humility. Challenger's legacy, written in loss and learning, remains a beacon for those who dare to push the boundaries of the possible. The Challenger disaster continues to occupy a unique place in the history of modern America, not only because of the immediate shock of the event, but because of the far-reaching ripples it caused across culture, politics, education, science, and even philosophy. It was not simply a mechanical failure. It became a mirror that reflected back the complexity of human institutions, the nature of ambition, and the limits of technology. To understand its broader significance requires moving beyond the direct sequence of events and examining how it reshaped lives, institutions, and ideals in the years and decades that followed. One of the most enduring aspects of the Challenger story lies in the way it altered the relationship between NASA and the American public. Before 1986, the shuttle program had been marketed as a triumph of technological progress, a vision of routine spaceflight that made the extraordinary seem ordinary. The public had grown used to successful launches, and the Space Shuttle was depicted almost as a dependable airline rather than a dangerous rocket. This perception was carefully cultivated through media coverage and NASA's own outreach efforts. The inclusion of Christa McAuliffe as the first civilian passenger was, in part, designed to humanize space travel further and draw ordinary citizens into the dream of exploration. Her selection was intended to highlight education, to remind children that space was within their grasp, and to send the message that the cosmos was not reserved for a handful of elite astronauts. After the disaster, this image of safety and accessibility was shattered. The shuttle was redefined not as an ordinary vehicle, but as an extraordinarily risky machine whose failures could play out in front of millions. This reframing of risk had deep consequences. Public enthusiasm for shuttle launches waned for years, replaced by a cautious respect rather than exuberant celebration. For children who had watched the Challenger launch live in their classrooms, the event became a formative memory, often cited later as one of the first moments in which they realized that even institutions as powerful as NASA were fallible. This disillusionment became part of a broader cultural moment in the late 20th century, a period when Americans were growing increasingly skeptical of large organizations and their promises. Challenger joined events like the Watergate scandal and the Vietnam War in contributing to a cultural climate where official reassurances were no longer taken at face value. Yet, paradoxically, the disaster also heightened respect for astronauts themselves. While the shuttle lost its aura of reliability, the individuals who chose to ride it were seen as embodying profound courage. The Challenger crew members became martyrs of exploration, remembered for their willingness to accept risks that most people would never consider. They were no longer simply professionals doing a job, but became symbols of sacrifice for the advancement of human knowledge. Their faces were placed on posters, stamps, and in school textbooks. Christa McAuliffe, in particular, was remembered not just as a teacher, but as a teacher willing to risk her life for her students and for a greater educational mission. This elevation of astronauts into heroes echoed the reverence earlier generations had felt for Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo astronauts, though it carried an additional layer of tragedy. In the policy arena, the Challenger disaster forced an examination of how political and economic pressures shaped technological decisions. NASA had been under immense pressure to justify its budget in the early 1980s. The shuttle was pitched as a cost-effective solution to launching satellites and conducting experiments, and the promise of rapid turnaround between missions was central to its funding. This promise turned out to be unrealistic, and maintaining the schedule became a source of institutional stress. The pressure to keep launches on time, to deliver on commitments to schools, universities, and commercial partners, played a direct role in the decision to launch Challenger despite warnings. The Rogers Commission revealed how this culture of performance metrics had seeped into every level of decision-making. In hindsight, historians and analysts often point to Challenger as a cautionary tale about the dangers of intertwining scientific exploration too closely with political deadlines and financial expectations. The disaster served as a reminder that technological development cannot be compressed into the rhythms of fiscal calendars without introducing profound risks. Another profound consequence was the way Challenger reshaped NASA's internal culture. The agency, founded in an era of bold ambition, had always operated at the intersection of engineering and imagination, but the disaster forced it to grapple with its own bureaucratization. Engineers who had raised concerns about O-ring erosion before Challenger had been ignored or overruled, not because their data was unsound, but because the organizational hierarchy filtered and softened their message. The Rogers Commission did not simply expose technical flaws, it exposed communication failures, illustrating how messages could be distorted as they traveled up chains of command. The lesson was clear: even the most brilliant engineers cannot prevent disaster if their warnings never reach those with the authority to act. In the wake of Challenger, NASA introduced reforms designed to elevate dissenting voices, to encourage a culture where cautionary warnings would be taken seriously. Yet even these reforms would later be tested by the Columbia disaster in 2003, when many of the same cultural issues resurfaced. In this sense, Challenger set a template for how institutions confront their own blind spots and how easily those lessons can be forgotten. The Challenger explosion also had a lasting impact on the field of science education. Because Christa McAuliffe was at the heart of the mission, schools across the country had a particularly visceral connection to the event. Teachers had prepared lessons around her flight. Students had written essays and letters, and classrooms were turned into viewing parties on launch day. The trauma of watching the disaster unfold live had a profound effect on children, leaving many teachers struggling to comfort their students. Yet over time, the legacy of McAuliffe's mission was transformed into a call to strengthen STEM education. The Challenger Center for Space Science Education was founded in her honor by the families of the crew, providing interactive learning experiences for children worldwide. The center sought to turn grief into inspiration, helping young people see science not as something abstract, but as a living human endeavor. In this way, the mission fulfilled part of its original purpose, sparking interest in education, even if not in the way anyone had hoped. Beyond education, Challenger influenced how the media covered space and science. Before the disaster, shuttle launches had become almost routine, receiving less media coverage than the moon landings or early space flights. Challenger, however, brought space exploration back to the forefront of the news. The shocking live footage of the explosion was replayed endlessly, and coverage of the investigation filled newspapers and television broadcasts for months. The event reminded the press and the public that space exploration was still perilous. In subsequent years, launches continued to be covered with more caution, with reporters often noting the risks and dangers involved. The disaster also foreshadowed a shift toward the 24-hour news cycle, where dramatic live events could dominate coverage for days. Challenger showed how television could unite the nation in moments of shared grief. but also how constant replay of tragedy could intensify the psychological impact. Psychologists studying collective trauma often point to Challenger as an example of a moment when an entire generation shared a single shocking experience. Adults and children alike could recall where they were when they saw the shuttle explode. This collective memory bonded communities in grief, but also carried lasting psychological weight. For children, the sudden confrontation with death and failure during what was supposed to be an inspiring moment became a powerful symbol of vulnerability. For adults, it was a reminder that even the most advanced technology and the most carefully planned missions could fail catastrophically. Sociologists have described Challenger as a "where were you" event, akin to the assassination of John F. Kennedy or the attacks of September 11, 2001, a moment so profound that it becomes embedded in the memory of those who witnessed it. In the international sphere, the Challenger disaster also affected perceptions of American space power. During the Cold War, space exploration was a central arena of competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. Challenger's destruction was watched not only in American classrooms, but around the world, including in Moscow. While Soviet officials expressed sympathy publicly, the disaster was also seen as evidence of the fragility of American technology. At the same time, it humanized the risks of space travel, which Soviet cosmonauts also faced. In an ironic twist, the Challenger disaster created a sense of shared vulnerability between rival space programs. Both nations recognized that no matter how advanced their rockets, the dangers of space travel were universal. In the long run, such recognition helped pave the way for international cooperation in space, culminating in joint projects like the International Space Station. Challenger's influence extended even into philosophy and ethics, raising enduring questions about risk, responsibility, and human aspiration. Was the disaster the inevitable cost of pushing boundaries, or was it an avoidable tragedy caused by flawed decision-making? For ethicists, the answer lies somewhere between the two. Space exploration inherently carries danger, but societies have a responsibility to ensure that those risks are not magnified by preventable mistakes. The Challenger disaster became a case study in how ethical lapses can occur, not through malice but through incremental acceptance of risk, through the gradual silencing of doubt. Universities began using Challenger in courses on engineering ethics, teaching students that professional responsibility requires not only technical competence, but also the courage to speak out. The disaster became a narrative cautioning against groupthink, against the pressure to conform, and against the complacency that can emerge in high-stakes environments. Over the decades, the Challenger disaster has also been remembered and reinterpreted through memorials, books, films, and anniversaries. Each retelling highlights different aspects: the bravery of the crew, the mistakes of NASA, the innocence of schoolchildren who watched in horror, or the resilience of a nation determined to continue exploring. Documentaries and dramatizations have kept the memory alive, ensuring that new generations learn about the event not as a distant historical fact, but as a living story with lessons for today. The annual ceremonies at Kennedy Space Center, where families and NASA officials gather to honor lost astronauts, reaffirm the idea that Challenger was not the end of exploration, but a painful step in its ongoing journey. Perhaps one of the most poignant legacies of Challenger is the way it has shaped conversations about failure in human endeavors. In a society that often celebrates success and progress, Challenger forced an uncomfortable reckoning with loss. Yet in doing so, it also emphasized that failure, while devastating, can be instructive. The redesigns that followed, the safety reforms, the educational initiatives, and the cultural reflections all emerged because of the disaster. Challenger became a reminder that setbacks, however tragic, can also be moments of renewal. This does not erase the pain of the event, nor does it justify it, but it underscores the complexity of human progress, that it is built not only on triumphs, but also on the lessons learned from mistakes. The Challenger disaster remains one of the most multifaceted tragedies in modern history. It was simultaneously a technical failure, an organizational failure, a cultural shock, and a deeply human loss. Its aftermath touched nearly every sphere: policy, education, science, media, psychology, philosophy, and international relations. The disaster revealed the fragility of human institutions, the dangers of ignoring warnings, and the high price of ambition. But it also revealed resilience. the resilience of families who turned grief into educational missions, of scientists who transformed lessons into reforms, and of a nation that continued to reach for the stars despite sorrow. Challenger endures not only as a story of what went wrong, but as a reminder of why we must keep striving to do better, to learn, and to honor those who gave their lives in pursuit of discovery. In the wake of the Challenger disaster, much of the public conversation centered around technology, bureaucracy, and institutional reform. But there was another dimension that deserves equal attention: the human dimension, the lives and legacies of the crew members themselves. Each of the 7 astronauts carried with them not only technical expertise, but also personal histories, dreams, and motivations that illuminate why they risked everything to fly. To understand Challenger in its fullness, one must not only recount the failure of O-rings and the missteps of managers, but also take time to honor the individual stories of those who boarded the shuttle on that cold January morning. Francis R. Dick Scobie, the mission commander, embodied the trajectory of the classic American pilot-turned-astronaut. Born in Washington State, he had grown up fascinated by aviation, working his way up from humble beginnings to become a test pilot and later an astronaut. His career reflected dedication and persistence. After enlisting in the Air Force, he climbed through the ranks, earning a degree in aerospace engineering and eventually being selected for NASA's astronaut corps. Scobie was known for his calm leadership style, an even temperament that steadied his crew during long hours of training. His life story spoke to the ethos of the shuttle era, a belief that spaceflight was not just a job, but a calling, a continuation of the pioneer spirit that drove earlier generations westward across the continent. He was not simply commanding a machine, but leading a team of explorers into a new frontier. Alongside him was Michael J. Smith, the pilot of Challenger's mission. A naval aviator and test pilot, Smith's career mirrored the blending of military precision and scientific curiosity that characterized so many astronauts of the shuttle era. He had logged thousands of hours in jet aircraft, testing their limits and honing the instincts required to operate under pressure. His presence on the crew underscored the enduring role of the Navy and Air Force in supplying NASA with highly trained individuals capable of mastering both the technical and psychological demands of spaceflight. Smith was remembered by those who knew him as energetic, approachable, and dedicated not just to his work, but also to his family. His loss was felt deeply not only in NASA, but in the military aviation community that had shaped him. Ronald McNair, mission specialist, brought with him a story that resonated profoundly with many Americans. Born in segregated South Carolina, he overcame barriers of race and class to pursue education in physics, earning a PhD from MIT and establishing himself as an accomplished scientist. McNair was also an accomplished saxophonist, blending his love for music with his love for science. He had spoken openly about his desire to bring his instrument into orbit, to play music in space as a way of connecting human culture to the cosmos. His journey reflected resilience and determination, and his presence on the Challenger crew carried symbolic weight. He was only the second African-American astronaut to fly into space. His legacy inspired countless young people, particularly in communities of color, who saw in him a model of what could be achieved through perseverance and talent. Ellison Onizuka, another mission specialist, carried a different but equally powerful story. As the first Asian American astronaut, Onizuka represented not only scientific achievement, but also cultural pride. Born in Hawaii to Japanese American parents, he grew up in a post-war America where communities like his often faced marginalization. Yet he excelled academically and pursued a career in the Air Force before being selected as an astronaut. Onizuka's story was especially significant for Asian American communities, who saw in his achievement a moment of recognition and inclusion on a national and global stage. His presence in space symbolized the expanding inclusivity of the astronaut corps, a reflection of America's increasingly diverse identity. His personal philosophy, often cited in his writings and speeches, emphasized perseverance, responsibility, and the pursuit of dreams regardless of obstacles, words that became especially poignant after his death. Judith Resnick, also a mission specialist, represented another milestone in the story of Challenger. She was the second American woman to fly in space, following Sally Ride. With a background in electrical engineering, Resnick brought technical expertise that was crucial for the mission's experiments and operations. She was known for her sharp intellect and her determination, breaking barriers in a field that had long been dominated by men. Resnick's story was especially meaningful to women pursuing careers in science and engineering who saw in her success a validation of their own aspirations. Her loss resonated not only within NASA, but within broader movements advocating for gender equality in STEM fields. In many ways, her career embodied the gradual but vital process of diversifying the astronaut corps, ensuring that space exploration reflected the talents of all citizens, not just a select demographic. Gregory Jarvis, a payload specialist, brought with him a background that reflected the growing intersection between NASA and private industry during the shuttle era. He was an engineer working for Hughes Aircraft, chosen to fly aboard Challenger to help conduct experiments related to fluid dynamics and microgravity. His inclusion on the crew underscored the shuttle program's promise of opening space to a wider range of participants beyond career astronauts. Jarvis's presence was a reminder that spaceflight was no longer solely the domain of military pilots and scientists within NASA, but could extend to civilian experts with specialized knowledge. His story highlighted the collaborative vision of the shuttle era, in which industry, government, and education intersected in the shared pursuit of exploration. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on the Challenger disaster? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.